It is awesome to be here. I've spent so much time on this campus, and it's so surreal to be up here. Most of the time I was over there, so it is great to be here. And yeah, of course, thanks to ConocoPhillips for sponsoring this speaker series and the first 12 years of my career. So that was great. And like Chanel said, totally unrelated. Okay, so before I get started on the talk, I have a few disclaimers and words of caution. This promises a novel approach to the Orphan Well Challenge. I'll be talking a little bit more broadly than orphan wells today. And if you don't know what an orphan well is now, that's okay, you will by the end. And if you don't, please come up to me at the end and beat me over the head and say, I don't know what that means. The biggest disclaimer though is that I am a geologist. So yeah, there's that. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an environmental professional, I'm not a regulatory professional. So because of that, you have to suffer through my bad jokes and my aversions to any more than one decimal place. So you won't see a lot of detail in the slides. So I'd like to introduce why I'm here. I started out as an oil and gas exploration geologist, and now I'm standing here talking to you about orphan wells. Well, how did this come to be? During 2016, I was working to help optimize the third round of layoffs in the last 2 years at my company. And I asked my boss, what are all these people gonna do? And, I got kind of the answer of, yeah, it's tough times out there. And, people usually land on their feet and all those kinds of things. And I leaned over and I said, no, really, what are they actually going to do? And it really started kind of eating away at me. I really wondered about that. And then a few weeks later, I was down at the top of the boat tower having lunch with a friend. And I was looking out on all of these office spaces that were becoming more and more empty. And I wondered, what's out there beyond the horizon that we're not seeing? All the development we've been doing for all these years, what's out there? I'd spent a little bit of time in the field, but not much. And somehow I had this feeling that we were on this verge of this tipping point for conventional oil and gas. And I had a feeling the people in those towers weren't going to be the only ones impacted by this. So I had no idea what the future would hold, but I asked for a severance package in 2016, and I decided to dedicate my time into figuring this out. And I wanted to help create the future. And so that's essentially what's led me to be here today. Here's the journey that I'm going to take you on with me today. We're going to start with a bit of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission call to action. We're going to talk about what the liability problem is for those of you who don't have a good inner working understanding of it, why the problem exists. We're going to just touch on the Redwater Energy Supreme Court case. We'll talk about that. I actually built my slides when my 5-year-old was looking over my shoulder going, what does all those words mean, Mommy? So hopefully you'll be able to understand it. And then at the end, we'll talk about some opportunities for innovation. Okay, so I am a fellow with the Energy Futures Lab, and part of our 2050 vision for Alberta is that we'll be a leader in energy-based partnerships towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada. And given that it's a huge part of our focus, we talk a lot about what that means and some of the meaningful work we can do. Some of us were fortunate enough to take a course recently at the Banff Centre called Truth and Reconciliation Through Right Relations. And so I want to share a few of the things with you at the moment and provide a call to action for all of you. So one thing that I've learned through the courses that I've done and the interactions I've had is that it's really truth and then reconciliation. Truth comes first. That's what I always hear, and that's what we're learning through this process. And so please find ways to educate yourself on the topic. Read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada report. It's excellent. It has 94 calls to action that are broken down by area of focus. And then read the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Canada has recently said that they're adopting that, and so it's quite important. And then the next step is to connect on a human level. There's lots of different ways of doing that. A previous IRIS seminar speaker was a colleague of mine from the Energy Futures Lab, Deanna Burgart, and she talks about indigeneering. And through her company, Indigeneering Engineering Inclusion, I don't know how she says that, she provides some more tangible ways for you to make your world more inclusive and welcoming to all people. And so I encourage you to take a look at her resources and participate in this however you can. Okay, so here's a little bit of oil and gas life cycle 101. So forgive me for the industry experts, but this is helpful in getting a sense of kind of what I'm going to be talking about. So we start off in the top right with exploration and drilling. You need to figure out where to put the well. Then you need to get the surface lease ready to drill it. You need to drill it, you need to complete it, and then you can start producing it. That's where all the barrels start flowing. That's where you make your money back. And then wells start producing less and less. And that's usually when, for companies with, I just noticed that the E is off, sorry. Companies with large overhead find it hard to actually make economic returns on wells. And so at this point, usually smaller companies that are more nimble and agile and have less overhead are able to take those on and squeeze the last few drops out. At that point, the well gets abandoned, cement gets poured down the hole, and it's sealed off, and you can start the reclamation process. Reclamation, the intent of reclamation is to restore the land to its original land use capability, which means that it needs to support the same use that it did before. So whether that's grasslands or forests or agricultural land or whatever. So what is the liability problem in Alberta? Well, liabilities in Alberta are accumulating very rapidly. I'll give you a sense. I'm actually ethically obligated as a geologist to start with a map. So here's the map. It gives you a good sense of where the inactive wells in Alberta are. Pretty much everywhere, except Wood Buffalo National Park. There's almost 90,000 wells that are currently inactive. That means that they're not producing and they're not abandoned. So they're just sitting there. They're not doing anything. They're just waiting for something to be done with them. And how has this been changing over time? Have we always had 90,000 inactive wells? Well, in 2001, we saw a huge uptick in the growth of inactive wells. So the red bars there, if you can see them, are cumulative inactive wells going up to just around 90,000. And then the other bars down below, which are going to be hard for you to see, the blue ones are new drills per year. So in 2009, we see that fall off because we start drilling horizontal wells, so we don't need to drill as many. But then we also see the green bars are the number of wells that are abandoned every year. It's not very many. And then the tiny little purple bar at the bottom, that's well sites that are reclaimed every year. So there's a huge gap between what we're actually being able to keep up with. It's growing at a steady pace. Okay, so the next problem is doing this work is extremely expensive. So often this work is referred to as closure work. There's a lot of work to do. So first of all, you need to do the downhole work. That can range from 50,000 and up into the millions, depending on your situation downhole. But you want to make sure that's properly sealed off. Then you need to do reclamation, except first you have to do remediation if need be. So if there's contamination or other impacts, you need to clean that up. Not all sites are contaminated, but if they are, it can get pretty expensive pretty quickly, easily into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then getting reclamation done. This is often not terribly expensive work, but it's very time consuming. So making sure you have the proper vegetation growing on the lease again, making sure you don't have any sinkholes, all that kinds of things. It takes a number of years. So all in all, on average, this process to go from abandoning all the way through reclamation can take about 10 years and costs $100,000 per location. Now, I gave you an average number. There's a big problem with average numbers. They don't apply across the board. And here's something to show that. So the green bars, which you can't see because they're too small on this scale of graph, is the security that's been collected by the Alberta Energy Regulator to make sure that there's some money left over to clean up the wells in case something goes wrong. So I think they might have had a good idea and started implementing this sooner with the mining, But essentially, for all of oil and gas in Alberta, there's $1.6 billion of security held. Now, you'll see the difference between calculated liability and estimated liability. The calculated liability is taking that average number for how much it costs to abandon and reclaim a well, and then multiplying that across the inventory. So we can see that the calculated liability in each of these cases is $27 billion for mining, $30 billion for oil and gas in situ, and there's apparently zero. I don't know if that's right. Now I'm questioning that. But anyways, for pipelines. So on total, $58 billion for the industry. But what are those blue bars all about? So the blue, we know the calculated numbers aren't right. We know that. We know that applying an average to this situation doesn't get us the numbers that it's actually going to cost. And so the blue bars are meant to say, how bad could it be? What's sort of the worst case scenario? Some industry experts that I've talked to actually say that that's potentially underestimating it as well, but it gives you a sense of the range of the problem. So somewhere between $58 and $260 billion in liability in Alberta. More money than I have anyway. So the point of the slide is, we've got a problem. We don't know how big it is, but we know it is really, really, really big. That's kind of what I'm getting at here. Next problem, companies go bankrupt and leave their liabilities behind for us to deal with. Well, not quite us. There's an Orphan Wells Association that handles all that for us. Except it's funded by industry, which is great, except it's a little short on how much they need. So the levy this year was $45 million. $45 million gets you started, but it doesn't get anywhere close to that $1 billion calculation. So the historical Orphan Well inventory is, let me explain who the Orphan Well Association is a little bit better. The Orphan Well Association is a non-profit entity that's funded by industry that handles the liabilities that's left behind by bankrupt companies. It's funded by this levy from industry, and so essentially any of the operators that are still solvent pay a percentage of the total $45 million. All right, so since 2013, the Orphan Well inventory has been growing. We saw a pretty quick uptick in 2016 to 17 and beyond. This is just the wells that are currently in the Orphan Well inventory. It doesn't factor in the pipelines or facilities. And it also doesn't factor in the wells that are being held currently for companies that are in the bankruptcy proceedings. So there's several thousand more than are actually shown on here. And this is the current Orphan Well Association inventory broken down by wells, pipelines, and facilities. So this goes through how much work they have left to do on them. The wells, there's 69 wells that need suspension, which means that they're still potentially actively producing or they're just turned off at the moment. 3,000 sites need abandonment and then reclamation, and 1,500 need reclamation work still. So often when we see numbers for the OWA or the Orphan Well Association reported, we see them as wells. So I'm going back to the last slide that says the well numbers. We often don't see the pipelines or facilities numbers in there. It's hard to kind of create the graph that shows all of them. But essentially, pipelines need to be suspended, which means that they need to make sure that product's not flowing through them anymore, there's no harmful substances, and then abandoned and decommissioned. But we don't currently do reclamation on pipeline right-of-ways. They often kind of reclaim themselves. And then facilities, there's still 9 that require suspension. So I'm not actually even sure exactly what that means, but there's still work that needs to be done. I don't know if that means that facility can just be turned back on or not, but lots to do. And then with facilities, there's no bar in reclamation because I think that's considered part of abandonment and decommissioning process, but there certainly is reclamation that's required at facility sites. Okay, we're not out of the bad news yet, I'm afraid. We've drilled a lot of wells in Alberta. This is what we're good at. We're quite proud of our history here. So in February 2019, there was over 600,000 licenses that had been issued for wells in Alberta. I'm going to block this off so it's a little easier to see. So the blue and the orange pieces of the circle here talk about the wells that have been closed. So these are wells that have been REC certified or are REC exempt and have no work left to do left on them. So there's about 122,000 of those. And the ones in color now, 482,000 of them, have closure work left to do. One of the challenges of this topic is finding data that you can understand and make sense of. And as I was showing these slides to some people, they were saying, change the issued category. That doesn't make sense. People won't understand what that means. This is actually part of my point. So the blue piece of pie is wells that, or licenses that have been issued. That could mean it's a license and a well that never got drilled. It could mean it's producing and it's making tons of money and hooray. It could mean it's just sitting there doing nothing, but we turn it on every couple of months so that it looks like it's doing something. It's really hard to know. There's a lot going on in that blue bar. And so one of my points is actually getting the right information to make sense of is a lot of work. The way that we're capturing this data doesn't provide a lot of granularity, and so just kind of chewing through all of that information is a lot of work. But moving along to my other point, there's almost 500,000 wells that need some kind of closure work. It's a big problem. So how did we get here? Well, there's been a few past approaches to liability management. Back in the 1900s, it was common practice to just bury anything on site that you didn't want anymore. That could have been drilling waste, it could have been barrels of oil, it could have been machinery that had broken down, anything. Dig a hole, put your garbage in it, cover it back up, walk away. So fortunately, we've changed our regulations since then, and it's not quite so bad. But a common practice right now in reclamation and remediation is dig and dump. So essentially, you take the dirty and contaminated soil, you put it in a truck, you haul it off to the landfill, you bring clean soil in, and you clean it all up. Well, I don't know about you, but anytime I've had company over and I frantically had to clean my house and shove stuff in closets, I've had to go back to those closets and actually deal with all of that stuff later. So while this is great in getting the contamination out of that site, and we're just moving it somewhere else. We're not actually addressing the problem. Some people in the industry jokingly refer to this as the solution to pollution is dilution. So that's dig and dump. That's kind of where we're at right now. There's also a huge implication in terms of the amount of trucks on the road and all of the work that needs to go into that. And is it eventually better to disturb those lands or not? It depends on the scenario. Okay, suspension. This is my favorite topic as a geologist. So suspending wellbores has gotten us into trouble a little bit. What has happened in the past is you drill a well, it'd produce, and then it would stop producing at the rates that you wanted. And so the team would come back to you and say, hey, this well's not producing like it used to. Is there anything valuable left in it? And geologists would look at it. Oh, yeah, there's uphole potential here, definitely. Do you guys remember when gas was $12? Lots of uphole potential, right? You could perf any zone you wanted and you could get gas out of there and you could make money, no problem. And so sometimes what happens is we look at those wells and we say, yeah, there's probably uphole potential, or maybe we could frack that shale or whatever. And so we say, let's hold on to it and then we'll see. Maybe prices will turn around. Maybe there's new technology. So that was great. Except now we're drilling horizontal wells. So it doesn't make sense to go back into vertical wellbores. And gas and oil prices suck. So we're not making money out of it anymore. So what used to be a very viable business practice has now become something that doesn't really make sense anymore. Now it makes more sense if you're going to exploit a zone for any kind of reserves to drill a new horizontal into it and get lots of reserves out. So we kind of backed ourselves into a bit of a corner there. And there's been some work done. There was a University of Calgary study that looked into reactivation. So how many of these wells are being reactivated? Well, they said that at the time, with a 200% increase in oil and gas prices, 12% of oil wells and 7% of gas wells would be reactivated. So it's quite small. So that's reactivated for oil and gas potential, keep in mind. All right, so what are we doing to help understand the problem? The AER, the Alberta Energy Regulator, has a program called the Licensee Liability Rating Program, or LLR. And essentially this is a company health check to see how companies are doing, a measure of their assets to liabilities. And right now the industry average is 4.8. So 4.85 times the number of assets as we have liabilities. That sounds awesome. Except anyone who's ever done an average before knows that there's some really big numbers that can help skew that in a particular direction. So let's look at it by companies. How many companies are there in each situation? Well, if you're between 0 and 1, that means you have fewer assets than you do liabilities. Right now, there's 325 companies or licensees that have fewer assets than liabilities, and 222 of those have 0. The number is 0. That means there's no assets, which is crazy. There's 172 companies that have between 1 and 2, which essentially means you have just barely more assets than liabilities. And then there's 234 companies that are in that 2+ range. So this is a really interesting picture, because as you plot this out, if you plot this out in a different way, you see a really long tail where there's a few operators that are essentially holding up this average for the industry. This shows us that there's a lot of companies in trouble or about to be in trouble. All right. The moment you've all been waiting for, the Redwater Energy case. Okay, essentially this comes down to, when a company goes bankrupt, do you use the value of the assets to pay the banks, or do you use it to clean up the environment? That's essentially an extremely oversimplified version of Redwater, but that's what it came down to. So this is called the Redwater Energy Supreme Court case, and it's about a company, Redwater Energy, that went bankrupt. And the question was, can the trustee use the value of the assets to help pay off the debts, or do they need to uphold their environmental obligations? So in the initial trial, the trial judge ruled that they just needed to pay off the banks, and the Orphan Wells Association would take on any of the liabilities. The majority at the Court of Appeal agreed. So this is when the Orphan Wells Association took it to the Supreme Court to get their say on it. They took about not quite a year to rule on it. It was a long time we were waiting for this. I kept did I miss that announcement? Have they not ruled on it yet? So they just ruled at the end of January on this. And that morning I turned on the radio and I was listening to CBC, and I was actually driving my kids to school at the time. And I heard what the announcement was, and I actually cried in the car because I was so happy. We've been waiting for this decision for a long time. I genuinely did not think it was going to go this way, and it's very exciting. So essentially, the Supreme Court overturned the lower court's decisions and said that bankruptcy is not a license to ignore rules, and that valid provincial laws must be upheld during the bankruptcy proceedings. So essentially, this was an extremely exciting moment to learn that environmental obligations need to be upheld in the moments of bankruptcy protection. I heard a lot about in my MBA, and we talk a lot about in business strategy, that we need to balance the environmental obligations and the financial obligations. And so it was really nice to see an actual evidence of that out in the real world. It's so easy for the money to win out, and I get it. I totally understand why the money wins out, but it's nice to see in this case that you can't just walk away from your obligations. Okay, some of the implications of this, hopefully, are that fewer liabilities will be sent to the Orphan Wells Association. A lot of these companies that are going bankrupt don't have a ton of assets left anyways, but any of the value of those assets can be used to put towards their closure obligations. This eliminates the ability of companies to dump liabilities into a shell company and bankrupt it. This was actually a somewhat valid, completely unethical, but somewhat valid business approach where companies were able to transfer liabilities into one company and assets into another company, bankrupt the one with liabilities, and carry on with the assets. And so there'll be greater scrutiny in things like that in the future. Like I said, confirms that environmental obligations need to be honored as part of bankruptcy proceedings. And this has implications not only for oil and gas, but other industries as well. And then another potential implication is that lenders may be more prudent in examining end-of-life obligations when they're investing or lending to companies. So not sure exactly what the implications of this will be, but there could be a case to say that some lenders may be a lot more cautious in entering this market, which, yeah. Okay. So what does everyone think about this? Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, or CAP, they actually lobbied for this outcome, so they were quite happy. There's 406 companies right now that have a LMR of over 1, so those yellow and green companies. And those 406 companies don't want any more obligation to the Orphan Wells Association than they need. They want to operate their wells safely, they want to deal with their end-of-life obligations, and so many of the operators are actually pleased with this outcome. I saw a few things on social media when the decision came out that said, oh, these poor oil and gas companies need to clean up their environmental damage now. But actually, the oil and gas companies are largely happy with this outcome. So that may come as a surprise to some of you. The AER was also pleased with the outcome, clearly, because they were on that side of the court case. But they also recognized the huge implications this could have for other industries as well. And ATB Financial was actually Redwater Energy's lender. And so they say that it was important to get clarity on the interpretation of the law so that they can find the right approach in balancing the environment and economics, and that they'll continue to support the energy industry. Okay. Now we get into the solution space. So the first thing to recognize when we start talking about solutions is this is a very fragile and delicate situation we're dealing with here. As you could tell by the LMR graphs of the red, yellow, and green bars, there's a lot of companies that are on the verge of bankruptcy. And so when we're designing an intervention in any system, we need to be careful. But in this case particular, we want to be very careful. If you start imposing regulations that are too strict, you could potentially cause those companies to go bankrupt a lot quicker, which upticks the orphan well count. Not a good situation. So while I'd love to stand up here and say we need to put some stricter rules around that, the time has, we should have done that a long time ago, basically, but here we are now. Okay, so speaking of legislation and regulation, we're told that there's some changes that are coming in this space. Alberta Energy reviewed some of these policies in 2017, still waiting for some of those outcomes. But one of the most recent examples is this Specified Enactment Direction 002 that just came out last month. And so this actually has some amendments in it that make it a lot easier for companies to take out overlapping surface lease. So you could actually use a well site that was in use before and not be liable for all of the contamination or impacts to it that were there before. So this creates new opportunities for people to come in and start up in system or in places that they might not have had the opportunity before. But we should see more on that, especially with this ruling of the Redwater case. We should see more on that in the next few months and years. Probably not until the election's over, but hopefully soon after that. Timelines. Okay, one thing that I didn't talk about when we were talking about the life cycle of a well is that right now there are currently no timelines for closure work. So if a well has not been producing for more than 6 to 12 months, you have to go and suspend it. But once a well has been suspended, there's no clock that's ticking on that well. You can pay your surface lease rentals and leave that in the state that it is as long as you like. And companies are even now sometimes not even paying the surface lease rentals. And so it's creating a bit of a problem on that end too. So imposing some timelines that encourages companies to get around to it a little bit quicker is important. Area-based closure. So this is a new voluntary program that the AER has put in place that encourages collaboration between operators. So essentially what this is doing is it's relaxing the requirements on lower risk wells in order to free up some capital to go towards the higher risk wells and in order to get some area efficiencies. So in order for companies to participate in this, they need to meet certain reduction targets, and then they need to provide all of their data through the database, which hopefully will give the AER and eventually all of us a better sense of the scope of this work. Because right now we saw that calculated liability versus estimated liability, huge difference. It's because we don't really understand what these things cost to deal with. Okay, so at Regenerate Alberta, our mission is to regenerate Alberta's economy and put people back to work by finding the value in what's being left behind by the oil and gas industry. So I told you a little bit about the origin story of Regenerate Alberta back in 2016. A little bit more to that story is that I'd also just watched the movie The Big Short, and that was really kind of stuck in my head. And for those of you who don't know what that's about, it's about the people who bet on the mortgage crisis, or bet against the mortgage crisis, I suppose. And they realized this crisis was coming, and they thought, how can we actually make money off of this? And I thought, that's kind of genius. This is a crisis that's coming. How could we make money off of this? What if this could be the new future? And then one of the other things I was wondering is, you know what? If it was the zombie apocalypse right now, what would we see as having value? We tend to only see value in the new thing, the new production out of the new zone, the new car, all of that kind of thing. But what if we actually reframed our thinking of value and said, what is the value of what's here? You know, there's the scrap metal value, there's the pads that are built up to hold incredible equipment, there's the natural value, there's the ecological value, there's all sorts of value. So that's been the driving question behind Regenerate Alberta, which is how can we create value? One of the ideas we had was this, taking old leases and turning them into community solar farms. Well, it just so happens that a few colleagues of mine are undertaking a solar demonstration site on an old orphan well site near Tabor. So Tabor, as many of you know, is famous for Tabor corn. Well, this particular farmer grows excellent Tabor corn and is not able to grow on this site. It's been hugely contaminated. The contamination has seeped off of lease, and so something needs to be done with this space. Well, it also turns out that this farmer has huge electricity bills for irrigation. And so they've decided to take on a pilot to install solar on this orphan well site and try and reduce some of the electricity bills. For those of you who are familiar with oil and gas development, we often develop in clusters, right? We put lots of wells together in the same area. So what you could do in a community like this is take some of those clusters and build them out as individual solar farms, and then build that into a community solar farm co-op, where all of the farmers in the area could see a reduction in their power bills because of each one of them having a site on their land. But you'd get the efficiencies of scale of doing it as a bigger undertaking. So that organization that's doing this trial site is called Renew Well, and they were nice enough to provide me with this slide, which they've estimated if they did solar on 10% of the inactive leases in Alberta, that would be approximately 40,000 acres turned over to solar. Now, these are all of Keith's numbers, so he gave me a spreadsheet so I could double check them, but I'm not as familiar with them as he is. But essentially, what we're looking at here is $832 million in annual revenue generated, and 72,000 person years of employment from this work. And you're not taking any new wells or new greenfield space out to do this development. So for those of you following along, Alberta has a 2030 target to have 30% of our electricity generated from renewable sources. Well, I don't know the land we're going to use for all of that, but wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to take out new land out of the agricultural base or forestry or grasslands or anything like that to do that, if we could actually use the sites we've already built and developed and created infrastructure to. So one of the fun things that we did when we were engaging in Regenerate Alberta was to hold fun sessions where we would brainstorm all the different uses of an oil and gas infrastructure. So it could have been lease, it could have been a facility, it could be something. And we've come up with 56 of them, 56 different ways to repurpose oil and gas infrastructure. I've plotted them from least complex to most complex. One of the least complex being a forest. Just dig up the dirt and put some trees in it and turn it into a forest again. That would be great. All the way through wildlife rehabilitation areas, edible forests, athletic fields, campgrounds, playgrounds, potentially even landfills, carbon capture and sequestration facility, all the way into the renewable energy space, geothermal, lithium, solar farm, wind farm. It could be a residential space. And I know we can't really do this onshore Alberta, but I had to put it up because it's fun anyways. Rig to reef. So this has actually been done 420 times. They turn reefs in the offshore Gulf of Mexico they turn offshore drilling rigs into reefs. And this is actually a fairly well-established practice now. So if a company decides at the end of the life of their drilling platform that they don't want to get the scrap metal value out of that anymore, then they can donate it and the proper individuals will take that over and turn it into a reef for marine habitat. So there's lots we can do. But the problem is there's no silver bullet. And in the Energy Futures Lab, I think it was Maggie Hanna that brought us the phrase, there's no silver bullet, there's just a silver buckshot. So this is my silver buckshot. There's no real one-size-fits-all solution. Okay, so what are the expected benefits? Well, clearly we can get additional sources of revenue from these things. One of the other benefits is that you can extend the time frame for your reclamation obligations this way. So if you can use a 30-year amortization on reclamation instead of 3 to 5, you can actually take that out over a longer period of time and it's not so expensive. And it also increases your opportunities for reclamation and remediation. There's bioremediation and phytoremediation and other sorts of chemicals that are a lot slower in the remediation process. But if you've got solar panels up for the next 30 years, you can undertake some of those more natural processes and it gives you lots more natural options rather than just the dig and dump. Again, it reduces the amount of greenfield space and agricultural land that we use for renewable energy projects or any other development. And this engages and empowers the community and landowners, which before, if you're a community member or landowner and an oil and gas company said, we want to drill on your land, essentially your option was to say yes. That was essentially your option. And often those lease payments were great and farmers loved those and landowners thought that was awesome. Some people not so much. But this actually turns this around a little bit where now the communities can have an active say in saying, you know what, we would love, our community needs a mountain bike park, and we can do that right here. Or we just want a dog park to walk our dogs here. And right now there's a fence up and there's no reason we can't just walk our dogs. There is a reason, but it doesn't look that way. But it engages and empowers the community to have some sort of decision-making power in what the future holds for these sites in these areas. And I spent a lot of time working on strategy, both in my MBA and at ConocoPhillips, and development planning as well. And so when you know what you're developing for, you develop differently at the time of development. So if you know that this is going to be used as a geothermal location in the future, you're going to design your wellbore differently while you're doing that. If you know that it's going to be used as a community purpose in the future, you might reclaim it differently, all those kinds of things. So this can create better planning and better forward-looking plans if we actually start thinking of these, the end of life of these assets. Okay, I've got one last big idea to share with you, and then we'll open it up to ideas and questions and thoughts and comments from all of you. Okay, so what if we had closure data? What if we actually understood the cost, the scope, the risk, and the timeframes for closing off these end-of-life obligations? Well, I argue that with that information alone, we could create the Crown Closure Corporation, or CCC for short, so I don't have to keep saying Crown Closure Corporation. What would happen is you'd have some financial transfer. So at the end of life of all of these assets, oil and gas companies would transfer their licenses into this Crown Corporation, or CCC, with the appropriate sum of money that would handle the end-of-life obligations. That way, companies could focus less on reclamation and remediation and meeting these abandonment targets, and more on finding and developing and exploiting their resources. It would allow money to go into this portfolio that would go towards project work, portfolio management, and also this would be in the billions of dollars, and you could get some significant returns on that money if you could invest some of it while you're waiting to do the work. What else would happen? You'd need a lot of people, so you could hire a ton of people: environmental scientists, subsurface professionals, land agents, engagement coordinators, regulatory experts, tradespeople, you name it. We would need everybody to figure out what the next best use of these assets were. You'd, of course, partner with the Government of Alberta ministries. Got a number of them listed: infrastructure, energy, environment, and parks. And of course, municipalities, where the cities and towns would have a say. The citizens and other interest groups would have a say. Local Indigenous groups, landowners, local businesses, they would actually get to participate in this a little bit. You'd bring in the innovation ecosystem into this. You've got COSIA, you've got CRIN, you've got Alberta Innovates, Creative Destruction Labs, the Rainforest. There's too many to put on this slide, but it's a huge space in Calgary and in Alberta right now. If we could have all of these groups working together, we could find better end uses of these sites. You could aggregate them together so that if a company wanted to explore for lithium or geothermal or wanted to develop solar farms, they could do that on aggregate rather than having, okay, I'll go and get 10 sites from CNRL, and then I'll go get 10 sites from Husky, and I'll do all that negotiating, and oh, the lawyers don't like it. And you could pool it all together, and you could actually find the best strategies for the next best use and create lots and lots of value. So this is just one of the crazy ideas I had over the last couple of years thinking about this problem. I'm happy to share more of them with you, but this is one of the ones that I find particularly intriguing when I think about it. But you know what? We can't stop the tsunami. The tsunami is coming. And as Albertans, these liabilities will be on our shoulders eventually. So why not plan for it and get the most out of it that we can? And with that, I'd like to open it up for conversation.
My understanding is there's circumstances where the surface rights owner could end up with a liability for the well. And I'm a little bit suspicious probably that I don't have all the information here, but it's probably where the surface rights owner also owns the mineral rights, and that would probably make sense. Could you, did any of your research, you come across any of that?
Yeah, so if a surface rights owner also owns the mineral rights, that's definitely a unique situation. And I can't speak to if that in that situation they would hold the liability, but essentially the surface rights owner should not be liable for the contamination on their site or that wellbore. That should be the obligation of the Orphan Wells Association.
So it's probably the exception that they own the mineral rights. So
probably.
The company
yeah.
went bankrupt. They just like the Crown.
Yeah.
The Orphan
exactly.
Wells is pick up the Crown's liability. In this
Yeah.
case, it's the mineral rights owner, which is
Yeah.
equivalent to the crown.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully that doesn't happen in too many scenarios.
Hi. Oops. Hi. I was a co-author of a book on reclamation a couple of years ago, and I want to thank you for a really excellent presentation. A couple of things. First of all, you mentioned contamination being a problem, but another issue is compaction. And because of that, a lot of farmers, and especially in forested areas, have had a lot of trouble restoring vegetation. So that's yet another reason to look at alternatives.
Yeah.
The other thing is the wells are one issue, but my God, there's 69,000 of those facilities, which range from single well batteries to huge gas plants.
Yeah.
And very, very few of them have been reclaimed. The large ones you can probably count on two hands.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was part of my light bulb moment. Was I'm generally a huge optimist, and suddenly something happened, and I realized they're not actually going to get reclaimed. There was a moment there where I said, either they can't be reclaimed for whatever environmental reasons, you can't actually restore them back to their original land use capability, or their money's not left. There's a cool example. The Shell Jumping Pound facility is being turned into a search and rescue facility. So it's in the perfect spot right on the edge of kind of the foothills there, and it's remote. It's away from people, so they can do lots of dog-related searches and all kinds of things back there. And so they're actually in the process of doing that. It'll be a training facility for search and rescue for Canada.
The industry that's kind of ahead right now is coal. They've had to, and they've been doing it for a long time. So, but those are relatively single sites. The problem with oil and gas is everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Your map
like my first map. Yeah.
Your map.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Julie, I'm a retired banker, so I was also very happy to hear the outcome on of the Supreme Court, because I think the environment should be a super lean, like paying your taxes and so on. So I totally agree with that. I must say your presentation is a little scary, and I'm actually surprised that I heard that there are other jurisdictions in the world that have been much stricter and tougher. And we always think that in Alberta we do the best regulation in the world, and I don't think we have here. I hear that in some states in the US, there's much shorter timelines and frames. So do we have to really reinvent the wheel here, or are there good examples around the world that we can accept, we can adopt readily here?
Yeah, no, there are great examples. And it is true, we often think about ourselves as kind of the gold standard. And like you said, in lots of states in the US, there are stricter timelines. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think we just need to be cautious of the environment that we're in and the implications of those introductions of new legislation. So I think we need new legislation, but how we actually implement it will be very important, that it's done properly.
And my last comment is with your big idea, the CCC.
Yeah, the Crown Closure Corporation.
Yes. My only other suggestion there would be, I like the concept, but maybe instead of a Crown Corporation, maybe make it an authority, like the airports in Canada.
Sure.
I think there would be better management involved.
Yeah, maybe.
Crown corporations get very political, so.
Yeah, fair enough. The Crown, or the Authority Closure Company.